Hello everyone, we are going to talk about the geospatial characteristics of states with a capital S. But before we do that, let's make sure that you know exactly what it is that we're trying to do here before we move on. We know what a state is, right? What's Iceland? Is it a state? Is it a nation? Is it a nation state? What are we doing? What are we talking about? Yes, that's right. Whoever it was in the back that said it. Iceland is a nation state. A nation state happens when all of the cultural characteristics of a place are in line completely within a place's state administrative borders. So when all of those things coincide, you get yourself a nation state. Good job, whoever that was. Awesome. What about Canada? It's Canada. Yes, perfect. You know this by now. It is a multinational state, not only including Quebec, but also a series of First Nations people. By First Nations people, we mean large indigenous populations that were literally there first before any French folks or British folks decided to hang out there. So it is a multinational state. Many nations, one state. And Belgium is no different. Belgium is divided into three communities, into three regions, a Dutch-speaking one, a French-speaking one, and a German-speaking one, with the Brussels capital region remaining fairly neutral and split between the three languages. Good. So a multinational state is one where you have a lot of different cultural identities embodying the same administrative region. Cool. Awesome. You're awesome. Great. So now let's look at boundaries and borders and state shapes and all that jazz. What I have here are some kind of interesting borders between countries. Actually, one of these is a border between a couple of continents. This right here is the border between the continent of Asia and Europe. And that's a rubber ducky, and that's awesome. So this is actually clearly marked. It happens to happen within Russia, which is why both parts of the sign are in Russian. And what you see here on the lower left is an interesting kind of border between Netherlands and Belgium. It looks like it just happens to be right next to a cafe, so you imagine sliding this chair over a smidge and then being in a completely different country. Now, what's really interesting is that until very recently, it might not be this exact cafe in which it happened, but there was a cafe that had the same sort of border relationship between the Netherlands and Belgium, and was actually the cafe was kind of split between the Netherlands and Belgium. The border kind of ran right smack in the middle, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except that in one of the countries, restaurants closed at, let's say, 9, and then in the other country, the restaurants close at 10. So what would end up happening is that you would have a country. The people on one side, let's say people on the Belgian side of things close at 9 o'clock at night. You would have the people move, pick up their food or pick up their tables, and then move to the Netherlands side of the equation so that they could be open for one more hour. So that's a very, very rare occasion. I believe that they've fixed it since then. But those are the kinds of funky things that can come up when you have borders kind of splitting places and causing havoc. So let's talk about those. But first, let's look at the shapes of states. What we are going to look at are 5 basic shapes for countries, and we're also going to take a peek at some landlocked states. Landlocked states, probably venture to guess, are states that are completely surrounded by land. They do not have a lot of easy access to ocean, which could be it could be an issue, but we'll get to that. Then we have different types of boundaries. We have physical boundaries and we have cultural boundaries. And under physical and cultural boundaries, you have a significant amount of subsections. A cultural boundary, as you well know, one of those, if there is a cultural boundary that has a spot within it that has a significant amount of conflict to it, that is a shatter belt. So we're going to look at the different types of boundaries and the different shapes of states. So what is a boundary before we go any further? A boundary is a line that establishes the limits of a state's authority. So, for example, this is country A on this side, and you have country B on this side. So there's a boundary here running through the middle, and it's on the surface. Now, these are the lines that we usually see drawn on most reference maps. But what a lot of folks don't realize at first glance is that boundaries are vertical planes, not just horizontal planes. What do we mean by that? A country's boundary also encompasses airspace as well as below ground, which is definitely something important to consider if you are conducting a mining operation. So if you're conducting a mining operation, at some point in country A, you have to stop your mining operation right when you hit the border. And if you are going from one sort of airspace to another, it's not like you can build a building up here and then have a long section of that building cross the airspace. This also counts as crossing a country's boundaries. So airspace counts, and below ground also counts as part of a country's boundaries. Airspace could definitely be a site of contention. Territorial airspace is 12 nautical miles north of the surface. So above 12 nautical miles, which is a lot bigger than your average ground mile. Anything above that is more sort of like international space. But your territorial airspace is up to 12 nautical miles, which can cause an issue in the case of a 1983 Korean Airlines flight, which strayed into Soviet airspace. And if your two countries do not necessarily have a very good relationship, or if your plane kind of veers off course and it's not in the airspace that it needs to be in as per the flight plan you filed, then that can cause an issue. And once the Korean Airlines flight strayed into Soviet airspace, they were not approved to be there, and they were shot down by Soviet military jets. Unfortunately, all the passengers ended up dying. As you can see here, this is where the plane actually went, and this is where the plane was supposed to go. So unfortunately, by just edging slightly into Russian airspace, you end up causing some serious issues. So you always have to be wary of making sure that you fly exactly the way you're supposed to go. And there are controversies that can happen below ground too. Mainly, probably the most popular thing that could be in public consciousness is a controversy over subsoil resources, namely oil. So have a look at Kuwait and Iraq, bordered by Saudi Arabia, and you could see that, for example, the Rumaila oil field actually is in between, kind of straddles two countries here. And then because of that, you can probably see that there might be a significant conflict between Iraq and Kuwait for the status of this oil field, who gets to drill into what, etc. So, examples of famous borders, probably one of the most famous borders that we know is the US-Mexico border. This is in San Diego. San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico. This is the border right here in between. And you can see some serious stark contrast between the two. It's actually really, really striking. And this is what it looks like from one end when people are trying to cross into the other side. When you cross at a border station, your vehicle is subject to search. Your personal belongings are subject to search to make sure that you're not bringing anything in or trying to take anything out that might be illegal to do so. In other parts of the border, this sort of area is very much highly staffed and highly controlled by border agents. This is the same sort of between San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico border areas. You can see the high fencing as well as the patrol vehicle. These places are kind of tightly controlled by border agents to make sure that everybody is where they're supposed to be, I guess. So now what kinds of boundaries exist? The first kind of boundary that exists is a geometric boundary, which is a grid system. The geometric boundary is the kind that you are likely to find on a reference map. Those are the lines that are drawn on reference maps. Then you have physical boundaries. These are your natural features. Mountain ranges, rivers, lakes, and deserts can all form actual sort of physical boundaries that are not necessarily drawn on the ground. They sort of form their own natural boundary. One can think of the boundaries between, say, like Chile and Argentina. One can think of the sort of division that we make between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, as in your map. We make that distinction because the Sahara Desert is a really, really good dividing line between the two. And we have anthropographic boundaries. These are your cultural boundaries that we have seen time and time again during our culture lectures that mark differences in regions of ethnicity, language, religion, etc. So let's look at mountain boundaries. Mountain boundaries can actually be really, really good lines of demarcation between countries, especially if they are difficult to cross, as in the case of the Andes Mountains, pictured here. Argentina and Chile agreed to be divided very, very easily by the crest of the Andes Mountains, but here's the problem. The crest of the Andes Mountains, meaning the sort of very, very top of the mountains. Of course, they didn't necessarily decide what position, what precise location that crest is. So it could be like over here, it could be over here, it could be sort of this long line, but it could be a few feet one way or the other. The one thing about using physical features, especially things like mountainous regions and deserts, is that because these places are not very administrative, they're not very cut and paste, it can oftentimes be kind of hard to really put a line of demarcation and figure out where one thing starts and one thing stops. Water boundaries and oceans are the most commonly used physical features as boundaries. These are a little bit easier than using things like mountains and deserts as boundaries. Rivers, lakes, and oceans, very, very easy to do. Boundaries are typically in the middle of the water, so like if you are drawing a line down a river, it would usually be down the middle of the river, but this boundary between Malawi and Tanzania that you see here actually sort of goes around the lake. Then when we get into Mozambique, it kind of cuts into the actual lake, which is either, depending on who you ask, Lake Malawi, if it's in Malawi, or if it's in Lake Nyasa. Here's another boundary. Whoa! We're zooming in. This is a sort of this is a grid boundary. One could also say that this might be an anthropographic boundary because we're talking about divisions between cultural lines. These are gang territories in LA. Not sure as of what year this is and whether the territories have changed much since. But this is a mapped territory of two gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, and these are the locations where they were. If you know anything about cultural boundaries, then you can totally see that this particular boundary right here, this particular highway, could definitely be seen as a shatter belt between these two places, definitely along this boundary here. And significant conflict happens throughout. And the freeways kind of help mark the territory for gang territory, to kind of help make this grid system. Let's look at actual cultural boundaries. So the boundaries between some states coincide with differences in ethnicity, meaning that you might see this border between the Netherlands and Germany and actually be able to draw this same line between folks of, say, Dutch descent and folks of German sort of cultural ancestry. Looking at language boundaries, especially in Europe, language seems to be the sort of cultural trait that marks boundaries the most, especially in Europe. Now, it is only in the 20th century where we start seeing a push to kind of consolidate languages for the purposes of better communication. Nationalities, what we would call a nationality, is actually very, very closely linked to the language that you speak, which is why I don't completely forgive somebody, but I kind of forgive somebody that would call a Hispanic person Spanish based on the language that they speak and trying to sort of link that with their ethnicity. Oh, you're Spanish, aren't you? I speak Spanish, but that doesn't necessarily make me Spanish. There has been kind of a push to identify nationalities on the basis of language, so I kind of forgive it, but not so much. But language is probably one of the most culturally relevant ways of drawing boundaries between two countries, or capital S states. Size matters. Oy, can't believe I went there. Size matters and location matters. And it could be advantageous for a place to be large or small for many different reasons. If you are a large, capital S state, you have vast access to national resources, natural resources, and you have a lot of space for your population to live in, which is awesome. But the large space can also come as a disadvantage because it might be a lot harder to administer it and be able to control everybody effectively if everybody's so spread out. In the case of the good old US of A, our non-sovereign sovereign states, and Russia, who's gigantor and was even larger when they were the former Soviet Union. Being large is great, and having control of that great land area is awesome, but it can pose challenges. Now, it can also be a disadvantage if you are small. If you are a smaller capital S state, like some of these states here in West Africa that you might have met in your sub-Saharan Africa map, and Singapore, you will have a slight disadvantage, could be a disadvantage, because even though it will be easier to administer, you can easily keep tabs on all your people, that might, A, limit the amount of population you have, and therefore limit the amount of population you have in terms of, say, military help, etc. And it can also be a disadvantage because of the availability of natural resources. You might not have as many rivers and lakes, different varieties of different kinds of arable land, forest, any kinds of different biomes. You might have that kind of diversity and availability as, say, a Russia, a Canada, or a US might have. Now, your relative location, right? This is kind of talking about absolute size. Now we're going to talk about relative location. It could also be a blessing or a curse. Depending on where you are relative to other things, it could be a blessing or a curse. If you are close to resources, then where it is that you are can be awesome. But if you are landlocked, which means that your relationship to the ocean or lakes and rivers and all that stuff is very, very not that great, you can face challenges. Because even though you might have access to a lot of surrounding countries, which might be good for purposes of trade and stuff, not having access to water will definitely limit your trading possibilities. This is a map of all of the landlocked, or rather a significant amount of landlocked countries around the world, and there aren't very many. And there's a reason for that. It's because people would much rather have access to some ocean or sea available to them for sailing and trade purposes. Mongolia is one example of this. as well as you might have met in your Sub-Saharan Africa map, Lesotho and Swaziland. Yeah. So these are your landlocked states in Africa, as seen on your map, which I hope to see next Thursday and Friday, y'all. Lesotho is unique in being completely surrounded by only one state, which is South Africa, and it is completely landlocked. Being landlocked is not a unique thing, right? We saw there were a decent amount of landlocked states, but to be a landlocked state that is completely encapsulated within only one other state, that's kind of weird, and that's kind of cool. The reason that these states exist, not just Lesotho, but also Swaziland, technically, these are remnants of the colonial era, and these are remnants of when Britain and France controlled extensive regions, and then when you sort of divide things up weirdly, then these are the things that can result. So what are the different shapes? First, I'm going to let you sort of have a look at the 5 different shapes of states, with a capital S, and then we are going to look at examples of each one of these. So the first one is a compact state, which is basically exactly how it sounds. It's compact, it's neat, it's nice. It's all together, and it's all kind of bunched up like, and it's really nice. This is probably, you know, depending on who you ask, it's probably the most preferred form of state to be, is nice and compact. Everything is easily accessible. You can easily administrate and lord over your people. Totally cool. An elongated state, like Chile is just that. It's very long and kind of stretched out, which could be an issue because say that, not, you know, your capital is kind of right smack in the middle, which is nice, but let's say that your capital is all the way up here. You're going to have a hard time administering over this territory and vice versa. So it could be very difficult in terms of navigation purposes and also being able to administrate over your people. Or administer over your people, is what I meant. That's what I meant. 3, the fragmented state. Just like the Philippines, any place that would call themselves an archipelago. Lots of different islands coming together. A fragmented state definitely has its challenges because even though your territory, just by mere surface area alone, has a lot of access to water, it could definitely be very, very easy for folks in the government here to administrate over all of these different fragmented places. A perforated state is basically, you know, if something is perforated, it's like it has a hole punched in it, and that's what South Africa has. It has a couple of holes punched in it in the name of Lesotho and Swaziland. And a prorupt or protruded state is one that has sort of something sticking out of it. It's not just long, it's not compact, it has one section of it kind of sticking out and weird. So let's look at those prorupt states. They are odd, they're definitely strange. They have an odd-shaped extension. Much like Burma, also known as Myanmar, you have this protrusion here. Afghanistan is also a prorupt state in the sense that it has this small little section that kind of sticks out and borders Pakistan and Tajikistan. Here are your elongated states. The reason that they could pose an issue is due to potential isolation. All of these places are kept very much separate and isolated from each other. The folks up here may not communicate as well with the folks down here. You may not necessarily have a good sort of national slash statewide unity. They can suffer from poor internal communications. Even though Rome is awesome because it's sort of like almost right smack in the middle, you still might see some significant loss in communication between, you know, folks in Milan and, say, folks in Sicily. Now, that brings us to fragmented states, which could be problematic because that means that you have kind of multiple territories within that state to defend. So, the U.S. is technically a fragmented state. If it weren't for that pesky Alaska and Hawaii, we would be a compact state. But Alaska and Hawaii make us a fragmented state, which could be problematic, because if Russia wants to start some trouble with Alaska, right, wants to start some trouble with us here, it might take a minute for us to get there in order to defend it. Same with our other territories, such as Puerto Rico and Guam, etc. The deal here with Panama, it is also fragmented and is kind of split by the Panama Canal. It is also a fragmented state. Could be a little bit harder to defend, especially when you have something like the Panama Canal right smack in the middle of it. In India, this could also technically be a bit of a fragmented state, because you have this one section of India and this one other section of India, the state of West Bengal, but then you have this other little part of India that is actually leased to the capital S state known as Bangladesh. So it's like India, the state of India, is split in the middle by Bangladesh. So there is an Indian section that is technically outside of its otherwise compact borders, which is interesting. And this section here is called the Bigha corridor. That brings us to South Africa, which is perforated. A state that completely surrounds another, and this is pretty rare when we're, as far as states goes. South Africa completely surrounds the state of Lesotho, which could get kind of difficult if you're South Africa. You do not have, sort of one continuous stretch of land. If you live over here in Newcastle and you're trying to get to Middelburg, you might have to go around, lest you have to go through another country in order to get there. Same thing, I guess, almost happens. I guess you could technically count Italy as a perforated state if you count Vatican City kind of being plopped right in the middle of it. But Vatican City, you can circumnavigate in 40 minutes. It doesn't count. South Africa is your primary example of a perforated state. Now, other kinds of boundaries, now we're talking about the boundaries that are on your sort of reference maps. Now we're talking what kind of boundaries are present when you're looking at your classic reference map. The first one is an antecedent boundary, which is drawn before the population established itself. So say that it is a relatively uncharted territory with a very, very small population, and you say, I'm going to claim this land, this is going to be the boundary between this land and this other folk, and that's just how it's going to be. Then you fill that place with people. That would be an antecedent boundary. A subsequent boundary, on the other hand, is when you have just a bunch of people living in a place, establishing themselves, and then you draw a line on top and dividing those people. Now, the thing with the subsequent boundary is that when you are drawing those boundaries after the population establishes itself, if you say, hey, this is where all the Spanish-speaking folks are, and hey, this is where all the German-speaking folks are, if you look at those cultural divisions and draw the boundary along the same lines as those cultural patterns, good for you, you're a subsequent boundary. On the other hand, if you're just like, screw it, I'm just going to carve up this place and I don't really care who lives there, then that is a superimposed boundary. It is still drawn after the population establishes itself, but it does not respect existing cultural patterns. And often superimposed boundaries are how you get multinational states, like Canada or like Belgium, for example. And then you have a relict boundary. A relict boundary is a boundary that has ceased to exist, but the imprint remains on the cultural landscape. The cultural landscape, of course, is referring to the built environment. So think about the amount of change we've experienced in the last 100 years or so in terms of the number of states. Some states have come, some states have gone, but maybe the boundaries between those states that are no longer, maybe they reunited, maybe they split, maybe they're divided on different lines, maybe you could see the remnants of those boundaries in terms of things like the cultural landscape, which is the built environment. So we're thinking maybe a road that used to mark the division between two countries that isn't necessarily needed anymore, a road, a railroad, other such sort of maybe one building type that is a culture trait of one area, and then right across the street you start seeing other examples of culture traits from the other country, but now they're all united, so now it looks kind of weird because you just have two different types of houses across the street from each other. Those could be part of relic boundaries. So let's look at them. Let's look at examples. An antecedent boundary would be just like the boundary between Malaysia and Indonesia. These boundaries were established way before Malaysia and Indonesia established themselves. So you can kind of see common divisions along cultural lines, and it seems not seamless, but the seam is actually very, very good and very fitting. A subsequent boundary example would be the boundary between Vietnam and China. A subsequent boundary was drawn after the population established itself, but in drawing the boundary, people recognized that there were people of common ancestry here and people of a completely different common ancestry here, and they decided to draw a line fitting the cultural division. On the other hand, someone went and said, we're just going to split this island right down the middle without any necessary regard for cultural divisions, which is why some of you might have brought up this sort of strange anomaly that was pointed out in New Guinea. The island itself is called New Guinea. This is the whole island, right? Papua New Guinea is its own capital S state, and this section of the island of New Guinea is a part of Indonesia. Problem is that Indonesia sort of took this half of New Guinea, but all of these people share a common cultural ancestry. So you're kind of dividing this artificially, and you're not taking into account that folks from over here might be way closer to folks from over here than these country divisions might indicate. What we have here is a former border along Vietnam that may have divided Laos and Vietnam previously, and this is a border that no longer exists, but you sort of see a remnant of it. This is, I believe, looks like a river kind of dividing it, and then you sort of see the divisions because of the roads and railroads that are kind of using this old border in order to make it happen. So now let's look at one example that you may or may not have seen a video for. This is about the border between the US and Canada, which is not a shatter belt. There is not a significant conflict between these two, but it doesn't make it the most neat boundary in the world. So do me a favor and pull out a sheet of paper, because I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to let you answer it amongst yourselves. Is this an antecedent, subsequent, or superimposed boundary? All right, think about the definitions of all of these. Antecedent, there before the population. Subsequent, after the population but still respectful of cultural lines. Or superimposed, after the fact and then not even caring about cultural divides. So the US-Canada stretch is a 1,300-mile, quote-unquote, straight line. It's not actually straight. Along the 49th parallel, which is the 49th line of latitude. A parallel is also the same as a line of latitude. It was established in 1846 by a treaty between the United States and Great Britain. So which is it? Antecedent, subsequent, or superimposed? What do you think? The Aozou Strip, on the other hand, it actually just says it is a superimposed geometric boundary. This straight boundary between Libya and Chad was drawn by European powers, and this particular strip is a very contested strip between these two places. You have a lot of roads, old sort of roads. You have primary roads and secondary roads kind of crisscrossing all of Niger, Libya, and Chad. But these superimposed geometric boundaries mean that you're kind of cutting all of these places, you're kind of carving them up without necessarily a regard for the populations that live there. And this strip is heavily contested because we're not entirely sure who owns this particular section. Is it Niger? Is it Libya? Is it Chad? Who knows? They don't make the rules. European powers did. Now, what about these ethnic groups in Southwest Asia? This is a, what kind of map is that? Figure it out, figure it out. I don't know. Yes, whoever said that, you're totally right. So this kind of map is outlining all of the differences in ethnic groups. So you see here the sort of Baluchi ethnic group, up here Pashtun. This is where the Kurds hang out, our friends the Kurds. These are very sparsely populated sections, not a lot of people there. Punjabi folks are over here. Hazaras over here. Tajik folks over here, coincidentally right next to Tajikistan. You have a significant amount of Persians scattered about Iran, etc. Shiite Arabs hanging out over here, and the Uzbeks kind of chilling over here. Now, what's kind of interesting is that you see all of these different ethnic groups, but their actual administrative country boundaries do not match these at all. So what does that make these boundaries? What does it make the administrative boundaries? If the ethnic boundaries do not match country boundaries, especially in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, what kind of boundaries are those then? Write it down on the same sheet of paper. No, you tell me. It's probably superimposed. Great. The Treaty of Versailles carved up a significant amount of Europe. Knowing what we know about a lot of European countries and their statuses of states or nation states or nations or multinational states, etc., remembering what we said about a lot of European states, do you think these boundaries are antecedent, subsequent, or superimposed? Write down your thoughts and tell me later when I see you again, and we'll see if you're right. And the division of Cyprus. We know Cyprus as being a multinational state, right? Cyprus, which is this little island off the coast of Turkey. And it is divided between a Greek area, a Turkish area. You have a couple of British military bases because empire. And the Turks actually gave up these little sections of land to the Greeks. And there's a UN sort of buffer zone in between all of that, kind of trying to keep everybody nice with each other. Now, based on that information, is this an antecedent, subsequent, or superimposed boundary? Write that one down, and we'll find out when I get back. I don't know. We'll see. And good gravy, Africa. Africa, as we saw when we were looking at the number of states, colonial Africa in 1939, there was very little of it, if any of it, that wasn't owned by anybody else. If we go even earlier than that, to the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, we see that Africa was even more owned by a whole bunch of folks, saved for this section over here, and this section over here. I believe this is Liberia. That was definitely everything else, somebody else owns it. So you see a predominantly French Saharan and West Africa, an Italian section of Northern Africa. Great Britain owns also another good chunk of it. Spain has a little bit of Morocco hanging out there. Germany also has a significant presence here. And Portugal has a couple of places too. And Belgium is right smack in the middle. Right. So Africa after the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. Are these antecedent, subsequent, or superimposed boundaries? The Berlin Conference is basically all of these folks meeting to try and decide how are we going to carve up this continent. So which one is it? Write it down and tell me next week. Now, we're talking about carving up a bunch of places and drawing boundaries and doing all that stuff, but there may be some places that have not been completely carved up yet or are still in a serious contention. These places are frontier regions. A frontier is a zone where no country exercises complete political control over a place. And yes, these places do exist in the world. Antarctica is one of them, and the Saudi Arabian borders are another one. This is Saudi Arabia, and the gray line refers to the current border of Saudi Arabia. However, in the past, these specific places were kind of under contention. This was the past frontier. These are zones that were not under complete political control. Nowadays, these boundaries, the one between Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as the borders between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, these are actually still kind of fuzzy, and people aren't exactly sure where the proper actual border is. Still trying to figure it out. It is a frontier zone. Now, Antarctica, that's when it gets weird. Antarctica is carved up like a pizza. It is like a very, very cold, snowy pizza. And Australia has a huge chunk of, wow, that is way bigger than I thought they would have. What might be even more surprising to some of you, or maybe not, depending on who you are, is that there is still a huge wedge of Antarctica that still hasn't been claimed by anybody. So if you're not doing anything this weekend, get yourself on a boat, plant a flag, and claim it in the name of Ice Cream Sandwich Land. Do me that favor. That would be awesome. So what you see here is that you have kind of interesting ways that the wedges are caved out, and they're not completely contiguous. You have this wedge that Australia owns, and this other wedge that Australia owns, and this one little French section in between. Same thing happens with Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom. They're all kind of dividing up this wedge in a really funky way. Norway, huge fan of Antarctica, also has a significant claim on it. Russia basically decided in 2007 that it wasn't going to leave a section of Antarctica claimed for long. In fact, they have laid claim to a significant section of the North Pole. Now, they planted the flag, and they planted the flag underwater. They dove under the ice, and someone dropped a titanium capsule that had a Russian flag in it, basically planting a flag on the seafloor saying, "This is ours. All of this is ours." Nobody knows what's actually under there, but people are guessing probably oil. Therefore, there you go. The Russian claim to the region is based on an international law that sets a 200-mile territorial limit stretching from the coast into open waters. Now, this green, these are the agreed borders between places. This is your border between Alaska and Russia. We know this. This is good. This is the border between Canada and Greenland, which is technically a part of Denmark. This is the agreed upon section between Greenland and Norway. But it's these sections of the borders that are still kind of contested. And what Russia is claiming is that all of this technically is within the 200-mile limit from the coast, which means that they basically own the North Pole and Santa, based on this international law. To be continued. We're not entirely sure how this one's going to shape out. What about space? We have a minivan-sized rover on Mars. We have an international space station. It's going to be really interesting as we make the push towards manned flight to Mars and other such exploration. It's going to be interesting to see how much of our geopolitics is going to extend into space and where it is that we are going to draw the line and how it is that we are going to draw the line between places. Are we going to have the same kind of measurements for open space as we would the ocean floor or airspace? Or are we going to have to come up with something completely different? The answer remains to be seen. Now that brings us to other sort of funkiness that happens within a state and within a state's space, if you will. That was a rough segue, but we'll deal with it. These are exclaves and enclaves. So an exclave is an outlier territory attached to another territory. An enclave is an area within a state that belongs to another state. So this is kind of depending on what relative position you are talking about. If you're speaking in the context of A, you would say that C is an enclave within A. If you are talking in relation to country B, then you would say that C is an exclave that resides in country A. So it all depends on kind of what position you're taking to start talking about it. So, for example, this is Azerbaijan, this is Armenia. This particular section we are going to talk about in terms of Armenia. So this is an Armenian exclave that resides in Azerbaijan. Ta-da. If you were talking about Azerbaijan, then you might name this an enclave, an Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan. If you're talking in terms of Armenia, then this is an Armenian exclave. Some other examples are the funky borders between the Netherlands and Belgium. So what we see here is a complicated border between Belgium and the Netherlands. There is this one village that actually is a sort of Belgian, well, let's see, is it a Belgian enclave or is it a Belgian exclave? If you're talking in terms of the Netherlands has a Belgian enclave. If you're talking in terms of Belgium, then you would say that Belgium has an exclave that resides within the Netherlands. So there is this one really small kind of village that, depending on what position you're talking about, it's either called Barl Nassau or Barl Hertog, depending on who you ask. So these are your funky regions between Belgium and the Netherlands that, because of these superimposed, subsequent boundaries, I don't know, you tell me, they kind of cause some funkiness. Which, I'm going to say last but not least, brings us to actual cities within these places. Cities within these places, within these complicated boundaries and borders. What we are going to talk about first is what is called a primate city, and I'm not talking about a primate city in the sense that it has a lot of chimpanzees running around, even though that would be deliriously cute. A primate city is a country's leading city that is disproportionately larger and functionally complex than any other. For example, Seoul in South Korea. Let's put the Seoul in South Korea. Seoul is actually quite literally the soul of South Korea. It contains over 40% of the total population of South Korea. That's huge. That is very, very disproportionately large compared to the rest of the capital S state. Another example is Luanda, which has almost 2/3 of Angola's urban population, which is a heritage of the colonial past. So what might happen is that you have a city that becomes the primary place for all operations to take place in a colonial region, and then because of that, so many more people are attracted to that place, live in that place, have operations within that place becomes the capital of that place, so that then when these lines are further drawn, and then you start carving out Angola to be this big, you are still going to have this disproportionately intense population of folks living within this larger state. 2/3. About 66%. Now, Angola and Seoul, South Korea, you might consider those in, like a stage 2, stage 3 situation of the demographic transition model. But now if we look at a place that's closer to a stage 4, stage 5, you also have primate cities in the greater developed world. That city is Paris. Paris has a huge, huge population compared to everybody else, to all other cities and villages in France. Paris is where the magic happens. Now, what is a forward or thrust capital? Now, just because a capital is capital, and you can identify what the capital is, which you are so good at doing on your map quizzes, and I really appreciate that. Now, what's kind of interesting is that depending on when it is that I give you those map quizzes, those capitals may not remain in the same place for long. Capitals often move, and they have a long history of moving around. Which brings us to a forward or thrust capital, which is a capital moved to a more central location for political or economic goals, and it's usually a planned thing. People usually pick out a site because of either availability of natural resources, or you want to bring attention to a particular region. For example, Karachi moved to Islamabad, so that there would be more attention paid to the historic interior. So you might want to make things a little bit more convenient. Maybe there's some sort of like a natural disaster that happens that forces you to move the capital, or you find it a little bit more defensible to put your capital in in an area that's a lot more easily defended. There are many different reasons why you would want to move a capital, but if it is moved, then it is a forward or thrust capital. Examples of these include Abuja, Brasilia, and Canberra. These are classic examples of forward capitals. We have Brasilia, which is in... That's right, it's Brazil, good job. Abuja, which is right here, right smack in the middle of Nigeria. And you have Canberra, which is where? Exactly. Awesome. Good job. That's good. Cool. So now that we have talked about borders and boundaries and all that jazz, I hope that you had a good time without me. I know I miss you. So enjoy. Have a really, really good weekend, and I will see you bright and early on Monday and or Tuesday in order to collect that little work you did on all the different kinds of boundaries, as well as move right on to centrifugal and centripetal forces. What holds these borders and boundaries together, and what can risk tearing them apart? See you next week.